The World Affairs Council of Greater Reining is the leading educational organization promoting understanding and enlightenment on global issues. I am Mike, your host once again for the evening here. And all right, there we go. Get everything started here. Great presentation today. This is going to be, I believe, our fourth in the Great Decision series. We've got people joining on Facebook. We've got our members here on the Zoom feed. We've got some Heritage members from their World Affairs, from their Great Decisions meetings joining us. I will remind everybody to keep yourselves muted during the presentation. At the end of the video and after Dr. Fegley's presentation, we will have a Q&A session. If you would like to ask a question, you can enter your questions into the chat and we'll take a look at those as they come in. You also, if you want to join live on the presentation, video, microphone, just let me know in the chat that you want to do that as well, and I'll bring you onto the meeting as we go through that Q&A part of the session. But as always, we're going to start with the video. So I'm going to cue that up here. Uh-oh, where'd my controls go? Oh, I lost track of my Zoom controls. Oh no, what happened? All right, there we go. Okay, here we go with the video.
More than 1/10 of global trade passes through a strait that measures just 20 miles across. The Bab el-Mandeb, at the southern entrance to the Red Sea, is a vital choke point on one of the world's busiest shipping lanes. But it passes through the heart of a dangerous region beset by civil wars and humanitarian crises. Great Decisions examines a region where the world's great powers can cooperate to create stability or allow deepening rifts to tear it apart. Red Sea rivalries, a conflict of interests. Next on Great Decisions.
Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.
The civil war in Yemen has become one of the defining conflicts of the early 21st century. 3 million people have been forced to flee their homes, and 15 million are on the brink of starvation. But peace proves elusive.
Yemen has gone through several versions of hell over the last several years. I mean, there's the major war that's taking place between the Houthi rebel movement and the internationally recognized government, which is backed by Saudi Arabia, by the United Arab Emirates, by others, by the US as part of the broader coalition, whereas the Houthis are backed by Iran and very few others.
Yemen is the world's largest humanitarian tragedy today. It's actually as much of a crime as a tragedy. 24 million or so of Yemen's 28 million citizens are dependent on international humanitarian aid to survive.
It may be Saudi planes that are dropping the bombs, but they are U.S. bombs. It is U.S. assistance that provides the targeting.
The Yemeni crisis has proven so intractable because foreign interventions have exacerbated the conflict.
The academic literature is quite clear. Most civil wars usually don't last longer than a year, partly because the parties run out of ammunition. But when outside forces step in and side with or support various sides in the conflict, that is one thing that causes these conflicts to keep on moving forward.
The United States has been selling weapons to the Gulf states for 70 years. They've never used them. Now, all of a sudden, they went and started using them without us being in the lead. And so now we, as Americans, are facing a series of dilemmas about what that means when they perhaps use the weapons in ways that we wouldn't.
It's gone on way too long without any party really being able to demonstrate that they could get a leg up. And it needs to be resolved, it really does. And we've been pressing everyone to sit down and get to the table and try to get a resolution that gets us to a substantially better place than where we are.
Yemen could be solved if the United States chose to solve it. The United States has essentially stood on the diplomatic sidelines.
Gradually, the war in Yemen has consumed the entire region around it. Somalia, Eritrea, and Djibouti have each offered their airspace to the Saudi-led coalition, and several African countries have sent troops to join the fighting.
The Saudis, obviously, they didn't want to send too many of their own soldiers to fight and die in Yemen, so they recruited others, and the Sudanese in particular have served as cannon fodder.
One of the major challenges for the Emiratis in Yemen is that they don't share a border with Yemen. So they had to develop facilities in the region that could serve as a sort of logistical hub. So enter Eritrea.
As the war continues, experts worry that a failed state in Yemen could destabilize the entire Red Sea region, with ramifications that would echo around the globe.
This is not a place where you want to see greater chaos than exists today.
The root of all of this is that the United States has not decided whether it wants to be the military hegemon of the region or not and set up an order, a geopolitical order. I personally don't think it has the capacity to do so. I also don't think that it actually lies in the U.S. interest to do so.
The world's maritime powers regarded the Red Sea as a relative backwater until 1869. That year, a team of French engineers and Egyptian laborers completed a decade-long project to dig a canal across the Isthmus of Suez. Suddenly, the Red Sea was part of the route connecting Europe and Asia.
An artificial waterway that was built for the trades and pleasures of peacetime has turned Port Said into one of the most important of the world's junctions.
The Red Sea was a dead end until the Suez Canal shortened the arrival and departure of goods to Europe and between Europe and Asia dramatically.
For the British, the Red Sea was the entry point to the Indian Ocean, and the Indian Ocean is sort of the great lake that ties together most of Eurasia. And so if you're looking to control or regulate the entry and access points of the Indian Ocean, which could be relevant in any future conflict scenario, the Red Sea simply matters.
This is the activity in Suez itself. How many million tons of war material are handled here, no one could ever guess. Food, munitions, the myriad needs of a great new nation from overseas, and everyone in uniform. Victory was possible because there was no blundering at the crossroads of the world.
Today, the shipping lanes through the Suez Canal and the Red Sea remain critical for global commerce.
It's a real crossroads. There's a tremendous amount of commerce that passes through there. There's a tremendous diversity of nations that use the area for a commercial passage.
This is one of the most vital trade routes globally, and about 2/3 of the trade between China and Europe passes through the Red Sea.
It's certainly very much a linchpin between emerging Asia, the resource-based economies of the Middle East and demographic potential of Africa with advanced economies in the European Union, Mediterranean.
The Red Sea corridor is as important in many ways than the Persian Gulf is in terms of the transport of oil. It goes through the Bab el-Mandeb at the bottom of the Horn of Africa, up through the Suez Canal, and then into the Mediterranean.
The world's navies also rely on safe passage through the Red Sea to reach the warm waters of the Indian Ocean.
The concern for the security of the Indian Ocean is broadly shared. Many navies keep ships present. For what purpose? To help assure freedom of navigation.
But it also is an important control point when we think about where there might be conflict in a next great war, particularly a conflict with China. This would be a very, very strategic point and really important for the U.S. in particular to have some presence.
Some analysts predict that the countries along the Red Sea are poised for an economic boom. Foreign investment, especially in real estate, is on the rise.
The Horn of Africa is a rapidly growing, economically growing area. It is, in many ways, it's complementary to the Gulf. It has manpower and land, both of which the Gulf countries lack. The Gulf countries have monetary, financial resources, so there is a complementarity. And in some ways, you could think of it as moving in unison in a good direction where all benefit.
So there's huge potential, economic potential, but this is a part of the continent that is going to have to achieve a certain level of political stability to actually realize those economic benefits.
Where I see some concern from some of the large institutional investors is with regard to land rights. And if investors aren't clear on land rights, this still remains a lingering concern and often will prohibit larger pools of capital from identifying East Africa or the Horn of Africa as a destination for investment.
The entire region is at the center of the key shipping lanes of the Suez Canal, the Red Sea, and the Straits of Hormuz. The potential of this region has never, ever been greater. 65% of its population is under the age of 30. Like all young men and women, they seek great futures to build, great national projects to join, and a place for their families to call home. But this untapped potential, this tremendous cause of optimism, is held at bay by bloodshed and terror.
The looming threat of terrorism, piracy, and war means that freedom of navigation in the region is never certain.
The piracy issues have abated quite a bit. There's occasional problems, but as a major international crisis like it was, a decade ago, no, it's not like that anymore. But the primary security concern now is the Houthi group in Yemen. If they're able to get a foothold again on the Red Sea coast, they're able to send missiles into the Red Sea, and that can affect shipping.
The narrowest choke point between Yemen and the Horn of Africa, its tip, is just 17 kilometers. So were you to sink a massive oil tanker in that choke point called the Bab el-Mandeb, you could precipitate a fairly significant security and trade crisis.
The richest and most powerful country on the Red Sea is Saudi Arabia. The holy city of Mecca, just inland from the coast, has long been a center for pilgrimage and commerce. In recent years, Riyadh has pursued an aggressive foreign policy. With tacit support from the United States, the Saudis have led the foreign intervention in Yemen.
Yemen is critical to Saudi Arabia because it is on its border. It's like Mexico to the United States. It's one of those countries that's always been a bit unstable, and that's always made the Saudis a bit uncomfortable.
The Saudis, with a broader coalition and with U.S. logistical and military support under the Obama administration, intervened. And that intervention has now gone on for several years, and the goal has been to dislodge the Houthis, weaken them, defeat them in some sense, and that has proven to be an unattainable goal.
I was skeptical about it at the time because I was no fan of the Saudis and their new leadership. I understood why there's a theory that, okay, by being a part of this, we could help restrain it, help try to direct it towards diplomacy, but clearly that didn't work.
Some observers charge that the Saudis have taken necessary steps to combat Iran. Others contend that it is the Saudis who are the aggressors.
Let me make it clear, the Houthis have been the principal entity that has caused the misery in Yemen. They attacked Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia needed to defend themselves. I accept that. But the way that the Saudis responded to the threat made the circumstances worse, and a lot of innocent people have been hurt and killed as a result of those activities. So the Saudis are accountable for the failure to conduct the campaign the way it should have been.
It's quite clear that the Iranians have played some role. It's disputed the degree of control that they exercise over the Houthis, but certainly they're providing armaments.
Yemen is not the only country where regional rivalries are being played out. In Somalia, too, competing Middle Eastern governments have taken opposing sides in a domestic conflict.
Given that the Saudis, the Emiratis, and the Qataris have an interest in East Africa, that rivalry is playing out in East African states, particularly in Somalia.
You've seen the Qataris and the Turks grow ever closer to the federal government in Mogadishu, while at the same time the Emiratis and the Saudis are working with some of the federal member state governments within Somalia. And that has undermined to some extent the state cohesion of Somalia.
Many of the countries in the Horn of Africa have been drawn into not just the Iran-Saudi, but also the Saudi-Qatari and UAE struggles.
Determined to secure their western shore, the Saudis have pieced together a coalition of like-minded neighbors to take part in joint naval exercises called the Red Wave.
It was the start of a plan to try to get all of the countries of the Red Sea to work together. There's a perception in the Gulf that the United States is withdrawing from the Middle East, and not just under the Trump administration, but the Obama administration. And so countries like the United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia have started to focus on protecting their own western flank.
The red wave, I think, is totally consistent with the Saudi Emirati strategy in the Horn of Africa region, and that is to politically, diplomatically, militarily, and perhaps even economically bind countries of the Horn to the Saudi and Emirati political project, and particularly their political project being limiting the influence of Turkey, Qatar, and Iran.
In an attempt to secure the Red Sea, richer Arab countries have also sought military bases on the African side, a trend that has the potential to upend the balance of power in the region.
That whole coast has been a scramble for military bases, for political influence, for economic influence, so there's a military side to it. We're speaking about the role that military bases could play vis-a-vis Yemen, but there's also it's a more broader military scramble. China's involved as well, the US is involved as well.
Djibouti is a site of a whole slew of international military facilities or foreign military bases. The United States, the Chinese, the French, the Japanese, the Saudis quite possibly going forward.
Some analysts worry that Arab countries are exporting their rivalries to the Horn of Africa, a part of the world with plenty of long-standing rivalries of its own.
You have a couple of splits, maybe three splits. On the one hand, you have the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, some of their allies, I would put Bahrain in that category, who are pushing in one direction in the Horn, which essentially means pushing against anyone affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood. You have another group, Qatar, Turkey particularly, that have somewhat better relations with the Muslim Brotherhood and are going in another direction. And then Iran gets in the middle of all of this.
It used to be that the United States government thought about Africa as one portfolio and the Middle East and the Gulf as another portfolio. But now those two things are colliding.
Many countries in the Red Sea region are under the thumb of authoritarian regimes that are profoundly unpopular at home.
You have governments on both sides of the Red Sea that are quite authoritarian. And from a Western perspective, that does not strike me as being the proper way to be going with governance.
And there are real questions about the future of these countries going forward because there aren't real political institutions. Everything hinges on a single political figure, a strongman, effectively.
In Sudan's capital city of Khartoum, hundreds of thousands of protesters took to the streets in the spring of 2019 to demand democratic reforms. They succeeded in toppling longtime dictator Omar Al-Bashir, but Sudan's military is unwilling to relinquish control.
The question of democracy in Sudan in many ways still hangs in the balance because the security apparatus that has unseated al-Bashir effectively is really al-Bashir's own government, right? It's still the old regime. They're very keen on retaining their political privileges and their dominance within the political system.
The role of several of the Gulf states is particularly important because they're effectively funding the Transitional Military Council in Sudan. So they have a disproportionate role in influencing what happens in the country. And unfortunately, money talks.
The Middle Eastern states, I think, their interests and how those interests are expressed in the Horn of Africa more or less fall into kind of two baskets. The one is an outstanding question about the role of Islam in political life. The second basket is really commercial and economic interests.
There is this sense that of a kind of domino effect, that if too many countries experience democratic transitions, other people closer to home might get ideas. So from a Saudi perspective, it's always better to nip these things in the bud.
In neighboring Ethiopia, a diverse country of more than 100 million, ethnic tensions have threatened the central government.
The protests incited political jostling within the ruling coalition, and you saw a rebalancing of power within the ruling coalition and the emergence of a new prime minister by the name of Abiy Ahmed. And Abiy Ahmed has taken on a reformist posture, and he's tried to do away with the old sort of authoritarian governing style of Ethiopia's ruling party.
He has opened up the press. He's opened up freedom for dissenting political groups. That is all for the good, but the ethnic pot is sort of boiling over, if you will. The lid was on the pressure cooker before, but that lid has been taken off, and now it's all spilling out. With so much at stake, it is little wonder that many countries, including the United States, have established a military presence in the Red Sea. Recently, some officials in the Trump administration have suggested that the U.S. should commit even more assets to the region.
These states are undergoing historic transitions of a significant magnitude, and they deserve that kind of level of attention.
The question is, will the United States apply or use the necessary political capital towards reining these countries in the Horn of Africa? And I think the answer to that thus far is either no or kind of mixed.
What we are doing in the Middle East right now is contributing to instability. We are not using our diplomatic or even our non-diplomatic means in order to be able to bring about a new stable order in the region. Instead, we have taken sides, and we have very much decided that the Saudi and the Israeli and the UAE line is correct. China, too, has entered the fray. In 2017, the People's Liberation Army opened its first overseas base in Djibouti, just a few miles from American, French, and Japanese bases. The move has raised questions about Beijing's military ambitions.
The Red Sea has been important for just about any country over the last 300-400 years that has aspired to influence in the Indian Ocean, and China's certainly no exception. So China's, of course, put its first overseas military base in Djibouti, despite promising for many decades that it would never do anything of the kind.
It is a milestone for the Chinese because before Djibouti, China never had a formal military base. Although they don't call it a military base, they call it Naval Supply Support Facility. And in my conversation with PLA officers, they also have made it clear that U.S. should not be too worried about the Djibouti base because it is only the first of many to come.
It's important to remember that the history is that we wanted China to participate in these counter-piracy missions, and now that they are going ahead and proceeding with sort of outfitting their logistics base there, people are suspicious. Maybe they want to use it for something more.
As China promotes its Belt and Road Initiative, experts disagree on how overt a role Beijing intends to play in the politics of the Red Sea region. The U.S. doesn't depend that much on trade, on commerce going through the Red Sea. China does. China, about 40% of China's trade goes through the Red Sea. That's a critical element for China.
If you look at a map of the One Belt, One Road initiative, it's give or take a circle that goes over land and water around the world. And it's meant to be the future of trade. It's meant to be this efficient circle of world trade where they're building the train tracks and the ports that are necessary to have a more efficient set of trade routes. And so that One Belt, One Road goes up the Red Sea.
There's been a change in the color of the Chinese foreign policy under the new leadership of Xi Jinping, and people are wondering how far that's going to go, and I think has raised a lot of questions about this so-called peaceful rise policy.
Some analysts worry that the U.S. has not engaged enough politically and economically around the Red Sea to offer an effective counter to China's growing presence.
One of the things I've heard when I'm in Africa is that the U.S. likes to complain about the Chinese, but they don't like to compete.
It is fully within the capability of the United States to compete, and where China breaks the rules, to confront. But to say we should oppose Chinese commercial and investment activity, or somehow it's a threat to us and we can't compete with it, strikes me as profoundly un-American.
Those of us that sit on the Intelligence Committee and the Foreign Relations Committee, and my colleagues up here that sit on other committees, are well aware of how quickly China is moving. And it isn't just the growth, it's the velocity of the growth of what they're doing.
The Trump administration certainly has a rhetorical acknowledgement of China's ideological challenge, but what you really need is a long-term diplomacy, building partnerships, the kind of more soft power elements of what we do, and that hasn't necessarily been a strong suit of the Trump administration.
The risk for American diplomacy in the Horn, or how the United States would get it wrong, is to make its interactions with the Horn not about democratization, economic development, but in fact entirely about containing China. I think that's entirely the wrong approach.
The Red Sea could be an area where American and Chinese interests align, presenting a valuable opportunity for cooperation.
I mean, it has in the past. I think most people in the U.S. counter-piracy efforts were quite pleased at China's contributions there.
There is this kind of hysteria in some ways of the rise of China and the growing prominence of China in the Horn of Africa. And they are there, and they're there in important ways, but mostly as providers of finance.
It's not inherently a competitive environment between the United States and China, despite some of the rhetoric out of Washington and in Beijing. But, you know, how do we find out, how do we identify what some of the areas of mutual interest, in fact, are, and how to pursue those openings in a way that's constructive and hopefully benefits not just external powers and broader questions of international peace and security, but also the people of the region.
Efforts to bring peace to the Red Sea region will test whether the international community can work together toward a common good. The stakes are high. The wrong decisions could create a fractured region of failed states and dangerous seas.
Great Decisions is America's largest discussion program on global affairs. Discussion groups meet in community centers, libraries, places of worship, and homes across the country to discuss global issues with their community. Participants read the 8-topic briefing book, meet to discuss each topic, and complete a ballot, which shares their views with Congress. To start or join a discussion group in your community, visit fpa.org or call 1-800-477-5836. Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.
And as always, I will let the credits run while we get ready to transition here. As always, very grateful to the Foreign Policy Association for making these videos available. This is our 4th presentation in the Great Decisions series that we've been hosting virtually due to the interruption to our in-person programming. We're very excited to be able to continue to do this and very grateful to everybody who's joined us here this evening. Thank you so much for spending the time to come out with us this evening. We've got close to 30 people on our Zoom meeting. We've got another 1 or 2 hanging out on Facebook with us. I will remind you that we will have Q&A with Dr. Fegley at the end of his presentation. So please start entering your questions into chat to make sure you can get those in. If you would like to join us live to come on using your camera and microphone, just message me again in the chat and I will help arrange that. And with that, I will bring up to the lectern, as it were, the president of the world, or I'm sorry, immediate past president, I guess now, to introduce our speaker.
1 more month.
Oh, 1 more month? Okay, sorry, but I know we just talked. Okay, sorry about that. The president of the World Affairs Council, Lynn Brown.
Hi, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. Let me introduce Dr. Fegley. He's a political historian at Penn State Berks College. He teaches courses in African, European, and Middle Eastern history, ethnic conflict in Africa, and international law. Joining Penn State system in 1988, he specializes in the study of mass trauma, especially long-term conflicts, gross human rights violations, and prolonged disasters in Rwanda, Equatorial Guinea, Uganda, South Sudan, and Sudan. He lived, taught, and completed his PhD research in Sudan from 1980 to 1984 and was returned there to work with other African countries, that country and other African countries numerous times. As the coordinator of the Penn State's 4-year degree program in global studies, he set up an internship program in Rwanda and India. His published works have examined Rwandan, Sudanese, Belgian, and Equatorial Guinean political history, genocide, the mythologies that perpetuate conflicts, elections and governance in post-trauma societies, and the rehabilitation of former slaves and child soldiers. Dr. Fegley, thanks so much for being with us this evening. We'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. I thought the video was excellent. They always are, but particularly as someone who's an expert on that region, I have some things to add to it, but there's certainly nothing in the video I would have questioned at all. Let me get on to sharing here. I have a, this is the first time I'm doing this, so bear with my fumbling around here. Can you see that? Okay,
Yes,
I see heads shaking there, good. And can you see my cursor? Okay.
Yes, we can.
Good. Okay. I put together, it's not so much a presentation as much as a set of maps and illustrations to add to what had been mentioned in the video. And of course, one of the great concerns of this region has always been the oil. And you can see here on this larger map, all of the oil fields. I'm not sure, given what has happened to the price of oil, how significant that is going to be. But nevertheless, for the foreseeable future, there's going to be large areas of the world, including large areas of East Asia, such as China and Japan, as well as European countries that will depend on that oil. And so that is one dynamic in all of this. And as the oil began to be exploited, going all the way back to the 1930s, it was decided to run pipelines in a number of places. And most of those pipelines terminated in Israel and Lebanon. And of course, with Israel going to, oh wait, this is, my PowerPoint is not working here. Let me get back to here. As Israel was established, those pipelines became untenable, and eventually a pipeline was made crossing Saudi Arabia to the port of Yanbu on the Red Sea. But that is only one part of all of the significance of the Red Sea mentioned as a waterway, going all the way back to actually ancient times. This is Eritrea, and Eritrea, the word Eritrea actually comes from an ancient Greek word, Eritrea, and it denoted at that time, we're talking about the period immediately after Alexander the Great, the Red Sea, and indeed, no, I'm sorry, the Indian Ocean. And indeed, the Greeks and later the Romans used this area as a base for trade with India. So its significance in trade goes back a very long time, long before oil was discovered. And of course, adding oil into it makes a great deal of difference. On the map to the right, you can see the situation in this region as it developed at the time just prior to the First World War. And at that time, Britain, whose areas of influence are shown in green, was opposed to Turkey, which was one of the Central Powers allied to Germany and Austria-Hungary. And as a result of several campaigns, the most famous being that of Lawrence of Arabia, the Turkish Empire collapsed. Turkey was established as a secular state. And eventually, you can see a number of countries were formed from what had been the Turkish Empire. This includes areas here, Yemen, and also there was what became known as South Yemen, which had been administered by the British, and eventually, when it became independent, it joined together with what was called at the time North Yemen to form the country of Yemen as we know it today. And this it brings up something that I'm kind of surprised they didn't mention in the movie, because Yemen is one of the few places on the Arabian Peninsula where there's large numbers of Shia Muslims. Saudi Arabia is overwhelmingly Shia Muslim, as is Jordan, as is Sudan, as is Egypt. One of the reasons why the Iranians support the Houthis has to do with the fact that they're fellow Shias. And this is a dynamic that the Saudis are eager to put a lid on. So that is one part of so much that needs to be unraveled here. Another issue, and I think it may become even more important in the future than oil, is the issue of water, and particularly the waters of the Nile. Egypt was displaced 4 years ago by Ethiopia, which at that point became the second most populous country in Africa. It used to be Nigeria, Egypt, and Ethiopia. Now it's Nigeria, Ethiopia, and Egypt. And Ethiopia has been a very high growth economy. In the last 12 years, they have been in the top 10 countries in the world in terms of economic growth for 9 of the 12 years. And one of the things that they hope is going to fuel this is the building, it's almost completed, of the Grand Renaissance Dam, which you can see here on the map to the right. And that has actually caused disputes, particularly disputes with Egypt, who is not getting the water running downstream that they used to in the past. Egypt is very vulnerable. They have a few desalination plants in Egypt, but for the most part, well, overwhelmingly, the water that Egypt gets and that Egypt requires for its very large population all comes across its southern border on the, through the Nile. After the Nile crosses into Egypt, no other tributaries join it. So there's no other rivers in Egypt. And going back to ancient times, many people talked about Egypt having a downstream mentality and seeking to ensure its water supply as a result. And so that is a conflict that is not very apparent right now. Things are still at the talking phase in terms of negotiations, but it can promise to be very, very volatile in the future. The Egyptians also had a great dispute with Kenya, because Kenya has been creating much smaller dams that feed Lake Victoria, which is the southernmost source of the Nile. And the Egyptians want to ensure that they're not vulnerable as a result. They mentioned Ethiopia, and Ethiopia has in recent times been very impressive. The Derg, the communist dictatorship that ruled Ethiopia, was overthrown in 1991. For a while, Ethiopia had very strong leadership. I wouldn't necessarily say it was dictatorial, not compared to the other countries around it, but it wasn't far. As mentioned, President Ahmed of Ethiopia today is making a great deal of effort to free things up and to democratize things. One of the things that they have done is they have completely redone their government so that it reflects ethnic groups. And you can see the map of their various states here. There are various states here, each of which has a ethnic designation. In the lower left-hand corner, you can see a large region in red, and that is also apparent on the map on the right, and that is Oromia. And traditionally, Ethiopia was dominated by the Amhara, and you can see the Amhara better here on this map. But in fact, the Oromia are much more numerous. Many of them speak Amharic, and they probably are either first or second in terms of the size of ethnic groups in Africa. The one other competitor would be the Yoruba people in Nigeria. So these people have traditionally not necessarily been oppressed, but they have not also been very evident in government as well. And a lot of the recent ethnic unrest in Ethiopia has to do with the Oromo asserting themselves. You can see on the right-hand map, there's another division in this region, and that is the division between Christians and Muslims. And areas inhabited by the Afar and by the Somali, and then extending into Djibouti and Somalia are overwhelmingly Muslim. And then in the center and western parts of the country, there are some places with Christian majorities, and in addition to that, the Oromo also practice religions that originated prior to the coming of first Christianity and then Islam. Here you can get an idea of how diverse the people of Ethiopia are. Turning to Somalia, now, unlike Ethiopia, the people of Somalia are all Somalis, but the difference is that they are deeply divided into clans, into lineage groups. They all speak Somali, but again, on this map, you can see the diversity of the different clan groups. But something else that's been a factor in conflicts in the region has been the fact that Somalia spills, or sorry, I should say the Somalis spill into Djibouti, Ethiopia, and Kenya. And it was the policy of some Somali governments in the past to try to create a greater Somalia by bringing those areas under the control of a single Somali state. They mentioned piracy, and indeed the piracy is has been waning. You can see how it expanded up until 2010. And when they spoke about all of the bases in Djibouti, a lot of them were created as a result of anti-piracy efforts, which then later they have retained significance given the conflict in Yemen and indeed the conflict in general in the areas. Somalia has seen a decline in piracy, and a lot of this has to do with the intervention by those various powers until the issue of piracy came on the scene. Djibouti was originally a French colony, the French territory of Afars and Isses. And it was and remains a base of the French Foreign Legion, as well as a French air base. And no one was particularly interested in it until we get to the issue of piracy. And that's when you have first America establishing a base there, and then eventually the French base being used in part by the Japanese, but also by other European Union countries. And then finally, the establishment of China's first base outside of China. Eritrea is a problem, partly because It has a very, very strategic geographical setting. And on top of that, they had, until 2 years ago, an ongoing war with Ethiopia over border regions. And you can see in the bottom right hand corner the situation and who claimed what, and how eventually this was solved. And indeed, last year, Ethiopia reestablished relations, trade contacts, open borders, and so on with Eritrea. And so hopefully that conflict is on the back burner. One thing, however, that is problematic is the man pictured on this slide, and that's Isias Afwerki, who is the president of Eritrea, and indeed who brought Eritrea to independence in 1991, and has remained one of the more repressive dictators anywhere in the world, running right up to the present day. It remains to be seen how the open borders and international pressure and so on may change this in the future. And this may change in part because of the democratization of Ethiopia, but also in part because of what has been going on in Sudan, which I will get to in a minute. Africa's two youngest nations are in the region. Eritrea was established in 1991 and joined the United Nations in 1993. And South Sudan was essentially independent already going back to about 2004, and eventually voted to become independent. It is very unstable in many ways. It's landlocked, but also it has tremendous oil resources, all of which are pretty much on hold, first because of fighting in the south, and now because of the crash in world oil prices. The two people on this slide are the president of South Sudan, Salva Kiir, and he's now back as vice president, Riek Machar. And they have purposely color-coded them because Salva Kiir comes from the Dinka, who are shown on the map in purple, and Riek Machar comes from the Nuer, who are shown in orange. These are the two largest groups in a country where no group forms a majority. Looking at Sudan in general, including the division between what is Sudan and what had been the southern third of Sudan, now South Sudan, you can see this ethnic mix is not quite as severe north of the north-south border, but still the Sudan has a great variety of different ethnic groups and tends to be dominated by the group shown in yellow, which are the Arabic speakers. As luck would have it, there is an old Sudanese saying that said, when God created Sudan, he laughed. And part of what has caused tremendous conflict is the fact that much of the oil, and you can see the oil concessions on the right-hand map, much of the oil actually lies astride the north-south border and is bound to be something ridden with conflict in the future. But Sudan has seen changes. They mentioned the overthrow of Omar Al-Bashir. And since the video was made, the government of Sudan has decided that they will be sending Omar Al-Bashir to the International Criminal Court in The Hague. And it's not clear exactly when that will be. But the film was correct in saying that many of Bashir's people remain in the Sudanese government. However, that appears to be changing somewhat. And one of the things that is very likely to change the movie just happened to flash on a one of Sudan's generals who is responsible for some of the atrocities that occurred in Darfur, Sudan's western region, but more recently has been in charge of sending troops to aid the Saudis and Emiratis in the war in Yemen. I believe he, as well as his countrymen, have come to realize that the Saudis are bleeding them dry. And so that appears to be in limbo right now. There are Sudanese fighting in Yemen, but not in the large numbers that had been. Something else I do want to mention in this respect is that this whole situation is dramatically changing, you know, far from being just sort of an extension of the Middle East. The western or African shores of the Red Sea are very much in flux at the moment. Ethiopia is going through its democratization process. Somalia remains a failed state. South Sudan is close to being a failed state. The Sudan is in transition, hopefully democratic transition. And the big question mark is Egypt. You may remember the Arab Spring, and the Egyptians were very much part of the Arab Spring. And the Arab Spring, for the most part, with the exception of Tunisia, failed. Certainly, a great mess resulted as the result of the overthrow of the president of Yemen, attempts to oust the Syrian regime, and indeed, Egypt had free and fair elections, which then were won by the Muslim Brotherhood. And again, looking at the various levels of conflict, the Saudis are particularly keen to avoid the Muslim Brotherhood being empowered. Ultimately, after a year, the Muslim Brotherhood government was overthrown by the military, and the government of General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi has been very, very heavy-handed. And it's very difficult to say if Egypt had a choice, what direction it would take. Very clearly, al-Sisi is unpopular, but also the Muslim Brotherhood has been unpopular, and these are very, very deeply divided countries. In many ways, there were minor disturbances during the Arab Spring of 2011 in Sudan. But really, the knock-on effects of all this, in part, I think, prodded by sanctions by the United States, the European Union, and others, led to the change in government occurring not in 2011, but rather last year in 2019. This image is actually quite famous. It's a very iconic image. It kind of captures the protest movement and the fact that women were very much in the forefront of the protest movement, and certainly they had been oppressed under the regime of Bashir.
Is this our transition to the Q&A?
Yes.
All right.
Yes, yes, I'm getting there with this.
Oh, okay.
I hope that all made sense.
Yeah, excellent. Great presentation. And just a reminder to everybody who's watching, we've got one hanging out on Facebook. We've got close to 30 on Zoom. Start entering your questions into chat, and we'll get those worked into the conversation. If you'd like to join live, just let me know through the chat, and I'll bring you up. So I think what stood out to me most to me during the video and through your talk is that the apparent lack of U.S. involvement, right? We've got Yemen, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, we recognize these as kind of conflict areas, but also very important to trade, but also non-OPEC countries with violence driven by sectarian motives. So if we're taking our lead from Saudi Arabia and Israel, but we also know that China is focusing heavily on trade in the area, and we just heard a couple weeks ago from Dr. Stanley about China's trade economic focus in the Northern Triangle. Got the recording on our YouTube channel. Head over to check out that for anybody who wasn't on that live presentation. It seems like a kind of a recipe to really find ourselves behind the 8-ball and suddenly surprised by how far ahead of us China is in trade. I mean, is that a fair assessment? And what's kind of our safety valve there?
I think it is a fair assessment. But I mean, it's something that goes back quite far. And when I lived in Sudan, which is the first half of the 1980s, the presence of the United States was not great. And a lot of it had to do with American support for Israel. And indeed, that has clouded things in that whole region for a very long time. As a result, we have tended to, in the Middle East, have actually two major allies, one being Israel, the other being Turkey, who are actually the most unpopular countries in the region. And we had been an ally of Iran until the Iranian Revolution of the 1970s. And we've always felt the need to have at least one other strong country as an ally. And so eventually we managed to work our way into becoming attached to Egypt. And Egypt, in many ways, regardless of regime. And I'm not sure that Egypt is a very wise move until things settle. We had also been allies of Ethiopia under Haile Selassie following the Second World War. And we had a major listening base near Asmara in what is now Eritrea, which broke away from Ethiopia, to listen essentially to the Soviet Union. Ethiopia was overthrown by a communist regime at the end of the 1970s. I mean, we didn't do well in this region of the world. 1978, 1979, American power was really being eclipsed. Our ambassador in Sudan actually was assassinated at that point as well. And so we've had limited ties. Also, there are only limited resources that we get from this area. And I mean the area around the Red Sea as opposed to the oil. Even the oil is, for the most part, not brought to the United States. However, it is brought to other countries by American oil companies. And so it is very strategically significant in that way. And so we're late in coming in many ways, but in terms of trade, we don't have a whole lot of need for many of the resources of the area.
Are we not as concerned about the trade route through the Red Sea corridor as China seems to be in developing its one belt, one road strategy?
Well, I think the Chinese have a bigger stake, but we are concerned, you know, because while we don't depend on oil from that area, you know, if suddenly American companies such as ExxonMobil and others begin to lose assets due to instability in the region, that certainly would have a terrible effect on our own economy here at home.
So in the face of these apparently competing motivations, you know, we're allies with Saudi Arabia and Israel, taking our current cue from them. We want to compete economically with China, where they're advancing in this area, as well as the Northern Triangle that we discussed earlier. And then currently, I don't know how well established or durable this will be, but kind of a America First non-involvement strategy. Which do you think wins in the long term? What's going to break that?
I'm not completely sure because I don't know how stable the regimes of the area are. I'm really unsure of Egypt's stability. And even Saudi Arabia, I mean, there's tremendous pressures in Saudi Arabia. And as their oil income decreases, I can only see those pressures dramatically increase. It's not an enviable situation to be in. The one thing that has changed, though, fairly recently, is the fact that the Israelis are talking to the Saudis and the Emiratis in a way that they had been absolutely shunned in the past. And so there's some really strange bedfellows being created here.
Yeah, Randy Noonan from Penn State Berks asks if U.S. engagement with Iran would help in stabilizing the region.
I think it would help in the sense of perhaps being able to bring an end to this terrible, tragic war in Yemen. And I also think that it's a very good idea in general. I really think we should engage with the Iranians. To be honest, my personal belief is that I would rather engage with the Iranians than I would with the Saudis. I'm no friend of Saudi Arabia.
Do you want to elaborate on that a little?
Well, the Saudis have dominated the region, have gone out of their way to foment radicalism among various groups, including in Sudan, where I'm most familiar. They used to support the Muslim Brotherhood and later turned on them. All of the areas on the map that I showed in Africa send hundreds of thousands of workers to the Saudi Arabia oil fields, to Kuwait, to the Emirates, to the Arab Peninsula in general. And those economies are dependent on the workers remitting money back home. And this is a very, very long-standing thing. One of the reasons I taught in Sudan for 4 years was because most of Sudan's teachers had gone to Saudi Arabia, where a taxi driver could make more than the president of Sudan. And as a result of being a poor country being so close to a rich country, it utterly dominated it. And this was in many ways greeted with a great deal of disdain. The Saudis discriminate against the non-citizens in their country, and in the case of the United Arab Emirates, the number of foreign workers in the United Arab Emirates actually outnumbers the Emiratis themselves. And so I think that the oil countries have been in a very exploitative mode for a long time.
Yeah. So maybe the position on Saudi Arabia notwithstanding, Dave Carroll points out the U.S. has sold lots of weapons to Saudi Arabia, so you'd expect that the Saudis could fairly easily defeat the Houthis. Why has that war dragged on for so long?
Yeah, that is a very good question to raise, because no one seems to be able to answer. I do think that the Houthis are very popular in the areas they occupy. The Shia population of Yemen is mostly in the interior, where the Houthis are currently in occupation. It's not an easy place to fight a war. It's very mountainous. The desert climate is problematic. There are a lot of dust storms. There's a lot of times when weather is not clear to, for example, operate aircraft. As a result, a determined and popular group can quite easily embed itself and not easily be defeated.
A lot of opportunity to hold on and keep things going if
Right.
that's your interest. Sure. So given China's focus on not necessarily developing trade in the area, but utilizing the areas for the trade routes, you'd think that maintaining peace would be conducive to that. Is China doing anything proactive to reduce the violence, or are they primarily focusing on their defensive strength by building the military bases and trying to just build a bubble around themselves?
Actually, I think they're focusing on their trade,
Mm-hmm.
even more than defense, or trying to do something to remedy the situation. And this is true in many places. The Chinese presence in Africa has not necessarily been detrimental. Another area of my own personal experience is Rwanda. And following the genocide in Rwanda, the Chinese pretty much built or rebuilt all of Rwanda's roads. And it has one of the nicest road systems in Africa. And other places, the Chinese have been very active. One of the things that the Chinese have done, and now I notice that the British, the French, and to some degree the United States has picked up on, is instead of providing aid, they invest. And by investing, rather than giving what everyone would perceive, including the Africans, would perceive as a handout, they're actually giving the local people a vote of confidence. And so they've invested in various industries throughout Africa. I know they've invested in the Ethiopian coffee industry, which is one of the great booming industries in Ethiopia. They invested in a railway linking Addis Ababa with Djibouti. And so, you know, there are positive effects of what they're doing, but there's also conditions. And in some parts of Africa, the Chinese have bought up land to produce food for China, often at the expense of local food production, for example. And Madagascar is an example of that, where they own an incredible amount of the country.
So we do have about 10 minutes here left. If anybody has a question coming through the chat, we can keep this going a little bit longer. I think, so what's, like there's clearly a lot of jockeying for advantage. There's the trade advantage, economic advantage, there's religious conflict. It feels on one hand like an area that's very like dynamically evolving. On the other hand, these issues are kind of dragging on for a long time. What's the upside here? Like, are we moving in the right direction? Are we stalled out?
It's very, very uneven. I think Egypt right now is stalled. I think as a result of stability and hopefully democracy, Sudan will do better. But Somalia and South Sudan remain, I mean, they're among the least developed countries, according to the World Bank. And that's actually a euphemism for saying that their economies are regressing. Ethiopia, on the other hand, is doing very well. And it remains to be seen how Eritrea will perform. One of the things that's surprising, considering how small it is, Djibouti has been completely free of any kind of violence since its independence. And that's very likely to stay that way. And it's
attributed to what?
That Djibouti is also ethnically divided. It has part of its population is Somali, and part of its population is Afar, which are people related to the Ethiopians and Eritreans.
To what do you attribute that peace, given those divisions?
To some degree, to foreign presence. And I think in the initial stages, it was the French. And more recently now is the fact that Djibouti has become this major center for various militaries, as well as a major trade center that people don't necessarily want to disrupt. Certainly the Ethiopians don't want to disrupt their Djibouti because it's their major access to the sea. And they'll go out of their way to try to keep a lid on what's going on in Somalia, where they have intervened militarily in order to assure that.
All right, we've got two more questions coming through to the chat here. This should take us probably through to about the end. Dr. Needham wants to take us back to Saudi Arabia and asks, should we be punishing Saudi Arabia for the Khashoggi killing, and if so, how?
I'm not sure how. That's the issue more than anything. I think there needs to be greater efforts made by the Saudis to reveal what exactly happened. But really, in many ways, given its military situation, given the presence of American interests, particularly oil and construction companies in Saudi Arabia, given the fact that they buy a tremendous amount, including weaponry from the United States, all of these things suggest that the Saudis have a stronger hand in this relationship than we do.
In terms of like diplomatic timelines on a global scale, like, is that recent enough that it's still an open issue, or has the world kind of politically moved on from that, or what?
You mean the assassination?
Yeah.
No, it's still an issue.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, yesterday I just happened to see Radio France. France 25 on the television interviewed Khashoggi's Turkish fiance, and that's another element that affects this as well, in that the Turks are not letting this die. Because Khashoggi was certainly a friend of the Turks. There's still a lot of life in that.
Must just be overshadowed by other news at the moment.
Yes, yeah, it is. It's there, and if you look at what's being discussed locally, but it's not really making worldwide news.
And Turkey really pushed early on to even get the story out and bring more light to it. I remember from when I'll have
Erdogan President Erdogan in Turkey actually personally knew Khashoggi, and that's part of this as well. And he doesn't like the Saudis either. So
perfect storm. Okay, so if we tie this back to kind of current events, right? I was kind of thinking the same question Dave Carroll asks. The impact of the coronavirus. In Africa, will the coronavirus be terrible? I'm guessing the answer is safe to say yes. How is it either compounding or playing into some of the economic issues, the conflict issues?
I don't think it is. My main reason for it is that, first of all, there wasn't really a great deal of international travel to the most populous areas of Africa. The way, for example, Governor Cuomo in New York talks about all the people returning to New York from Europe and spreading it. So I don't think that it spread easily, but the other thing that's very evident, and every weekday at 1:30 I watch the African news on BBC, and everywhere I see masks. Everywhere I see people distancing themselves. And South Africa has just loosened up a bit, but there were trucks around many parts of Africa, South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt. I mean, that's about as far apart as you can get. Simply going down the streets, doesn't matter who was there, and just spraying everything.
Yeah.
I also think, and I've been saying since this has all begun, I think many Africans have been very cooperative with social distancing, with wearing masks, and so on, because they've recently been scared by Ebola. And you know, coronavirus is not easily spread compared to Ebola. I mean, Ebola is kind of like one touch.
Has that had any impact on like the violence, for example? Either it's heightened anxiety creates more fighting, or social distancing creates less fighting, and any evidence there?
I don't know. I can't really answer that.
All right.
And they won't let me go there to see.
It's tough to find out right now. Well, this has been a lot of fun. We've gotten through all of our questions. I think I really enjoyed having this conversation with you. Great presentation. I'm glad we got to meet this evening, despite our social distancing, although I can tell everybody's anxious to start to get back out into the world. So thank you, Dr. Fegley, and I will turn the meeting over to Lynn Brown.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Dr. Fegley. We really appreciate you taking the time to be with us tonight. Just in terms of some upcoming programs, we're going to be creating programs through the summer. And coming up, there's on the 10th of June will be our program on COVID-19 around the world with Marie Keim from Tower Health, who's the infection prevention officer there. On the 17th, another Great Decisions series called Artificial Intelligence and Data. Dr. Abdullah Konak from Penn State will join us for that. We have two new presentations, one on the 24th of June on Putinomics, Power and Money in Resurgent Russia. Dr. Chris Miller from Tufts University will join us. And on July 8th, we'll be having a session on Hong Kong and China with Dr. Victoria Yoi from Notre Dame University. So we look forward to seeing you at all of those presentations, and thanks so much for joining us tonight. Take care and stay safe.